Veronica Sinclair stepped into the courtroom with the air of someone who owned the place. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floor, each step deliberate, exuding confidence that teetered on the edge of arrogance. She was used to being the center of attention, and today was no exception. Heads turned as she entered, but she barely acknowledged them, her gaze sweeping over the room with the detached boredom of a queen surveying her subjects. Draped in a tailored designer coat, her hair perfectly styled, and her makeup immaculate, Veronica looked as though she were attending a high-profile gala rather than facing a judge. Her oversized sunglasses sat perched on her nose, obscuring her eyes, but the smirk playing on her lips was visible enough. With a slow, deliberate movement, she removed her sunglasses and tucked them into her bag, her manicured fingers moving with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Her lawyer, a frazzled-looking man in his mid-40s, scurried behind her, his expression a mix of discomfort and frustration. "Veronica, please, this is serious," he whispered urgently, trying to guide her toward the defendant's table. She barely spared him a glance. "Relax, Ben," she murmured dismissively. "It's a couple of tickets and a misunderstanding. This judge will probably just give me a fine, and we'll be out of here in 10 minutes. The courtroom, usually a place of strict decorum, felt different the moment she walked in. The quiet hum of murmurs from spectators and legal professionals seemed to pause as she made her way down the aisle. She could feel the stares, but instead of being intimidated, she thrived on them. Attention, whether good or bad, was something Veronica had mastered. She reached the defendant's table and, rather than taking a seat immediately, she stood there for a moment, adjusting the cuff of her silk blouse as though she had all the time in the world. Her lawyer gave her a pleading look, and with a dramatic sigh, she finally lowered herself into the chair, crossing one leg over the other with slow, exaggerated precision. The bailiff cleared his throat. "All rise," he announced as Judge Robert Langston entered the room. Veronica hesitated, arching a perfectly shaped eyebrow, as if debating whether she really needed to stand. When she finally did, it was with the most reluctant motion possible, her exasperation clear in the slow rise of her body. She let out a quiet sigh, rolling her eyes just enough for the people near her to notice. Judge Langston took his seat, his sharp gaze landing on her almost immediately. He had dealt with countless defendants in his career, but something about Veronica's sheer audacity was particularly grating. Without a word, he flipped open the case file, and Veronica, ever the defiant one, leaned back in her chair, drumming her fingers against the table with a smirk that said one thing loud and clear: "Let's see what you've got, Your Honor." Veronica remained poised, her chin slightly lifted as if she were a guest of honor rather than a defendant facing charges. The weight of the courtroom's attention didn't faze her, in fact, she welcomed it. The stiff-backed lawyers, the wary bailiff, and even the courtroom spectators seemed like an audience to her performance. She had spent her entire life getting away with bad behavior, and she had no reason to believe today would be any different. Judge Langston, however, was not a man easily swayed by arrogance. He had been on the bench long enough to recognize when someone truly understood the weight of their actions and when they were merely playing a role. As he glanced over the case file before him, he took in Veronica's demeanor, her relaxed posture, the way she idly traced the edge of her designer purse with manicured nails, the unbothered expression on her face. He set down his pen and folded his hands, taking a moment before speaking. "Miss Sinclair," he began, his voice calm but authoritative, "you seem rather at ease for someone facing multiple charges of reckless driving and endangering a pedestrian's life." Veronica didn't hesitate. "That's because I know this is all blown out of proportion," she replied, her tone light, almost amused. "I didn't hit anyone. The guy tripped, his problem, not mine." A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom, and her lawyer visibly stiffened beside her, his fingers tightening around his briefcase. He whispered something to her, but she ignored him. Judge Langston remained silent for a moment, his gaze unyielding. "I see," he said finally. "Tell me, Miss Sinclair, do you believe that laws exist merely as suggestions?" She smirked. "I believe laws exist, sure. I also believe this is a massive waste of time. I have things to do, Your Honor." "I'm sure you do, too. Can't we just wrap this up with a fine and call it a day?" The arrogance in her voice was enough to send another wave of murmurs through the courtroom. Even some of the more experienced legal professionals shifted in their seats, aware that Veronica had just crossed a line. Judge Langston's expression didn't change, but there was a shift in the air, a quiet tension that warned the courtroom that he wasn't going to tolerate any further nonsense. He flipped through the pages of the case file with slow, deliberate movements before setting it aside once more. "Miss Sinclair, I'd like to remind you that this isn't a negotiation," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "This is a courtroom. Your actions have consequences, whether you choose to acknowledge them or not." Veronica shrugged. "I guess that depends on what you mean by consequences," she said, her lips curling into a smirk. "Because honestly, Your Honor, I don't see what the big deal is. The guy is fine. People fall all the time. You can't seriously expect me to take responsibility for someone else's clumsiness." Her words landed with an almost physical impact. A hush fell over the courtroom, the weight of her indifference hanging in the air. Even her lawyer had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if he was physically restraining himself from reacting. Judge Langston exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the bench. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice level, but there was something in his tone that made the room hold its breath. "Would you care to turn around?" Her smirk faltered slightly, but she did as instructed, shifting in her seat to glance over her shoulder. In the second row, an elderly man sat quietly, his arm in a sling, his face marked by deep lines that spoke of both age and experience. He was Harold Peterson, the pedestrian she had nearly hit. Veronica's gaze flickered over him briefly, then she turned back with a dismissive shrug. "Okay. And?" The murmurs grew louder. The sheer callousness of her response was enough to make even the most indifferent courtroom observers react. Judge Langston leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Peterson, would you be willing to share how this incident has affected you?" Harold Peterson cleared his throat. His voice, though calm, carried a quiet strength. "I don't hold any anger toward Miss Sinclair," he said. "But I do wish she understood what happened that day. I was crossing legally when she accelerated toward me. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, landed on my wrist, and it hasn't been the same since." He lifted his injured arm slightly. "I was a firefighter for 40 years. I've helped people my entire life. But now, because of her recklessness, I struggle with basic tasks. Buttoning my shirt, tying my shoes. Small things I never thought twice about." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Even Veronica, for all her defiance, seemed momentarily uncertain. Judge Langston turned his attention back to her. "Miss Sinclair, does this still seem like no big deal to you?" Veronica hesitated for only a fraction of a second before her defenses slammed back into place. She let out another exaggerated sigh, her arms crossing again. "Look, I'm sorry he fell. I guess. But I still don't see how this is my fault. If he was walking slower, maybe this wouldn't have happened." The courtroom erupted in murmurs again. Her lawyer looked as though he might faint. Judge Langston's expression turned colder. "Miss Sinclair, your lack of remorse is alarming. And frankly, it is unacceptable." She scoffed. "Oh, come on. What do you want me to do? Cry? Beg for forgiveness? Let's be realistic. I didn't hurt anyone on purpose. This is just an overreaction. Judge Langston exhaled, then nodded to the bailiff, who handed him a stack of papers. He flipped through them carefully before speaking. Miss Sinclair, since you seem to lack an understanding of how your actions affect others, I believe it's time you gained some perspective. Her smirk returned. Oh, great. Another lecture. Can we you will be required, Judge Langston continued, cutting her off, to complete 200 hours of community service at the Westside Community Shelter. Veronica froze. What? In addition to fines and other penalties, he continued, you will report to the shelter every morning at 8 a.m. You will assist with meal preparation, cleaning, and serving those in need. Perhaps then, you will gain a better understanding of the impact of carelessness and entitlement. Veronica's eyes widened. You've got to be kidding me. I assure you, Miss Sinclair, I am not, Judge Langston said coolly. And should you fail to comply, we can discuss a far less favorable alternative. Her jaw clenched, her fingers tightening into fists. For the first time, her confidence wavered. You can't force me to work with, this court has the authority to enforce community service, he interrupted. And if you refuse, I can assure you the consequences will be far worse. Veronica's lips parted, but no words came. The room remained still, waiting for her reaction. But this time, she had none. Judge Langston leaned back. Miss Sinclair, you have spent your life believing that privilege exempts you from accountability. That ends today. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing her fate. Veronica stormed out of the courtroom, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor with every furious step. The moment she stepped outside, she was met with a barrage of flashing cameras and reporters shouting questions. Miss Sinclair, do you think your sentence was fair? Do you have any comments on Judge Langston's decision? Will you comply with the community service order? She barely glanced at them, her sunglasses back in place as she shoved past the crowd. Her lawyer trailed behind her, looking exhausted, but she didn't care. This was an outrage. A humiliation. By the time she reached her car, she ripped off her sunglasses and turned on her lawyer with a glare. I want this overturned, she snapped. Appeal. File something. There has to be a way out of this. Her lawyer sighed, rubbing his temples. Veronica, Judge Langston was crystal clear. This is a court-ordered sentence. You don't have a choice. She scoffed. There's always a choice. That's what lawyers are for, right? To make problems go away. Her lawyer's patience was wearing thin. This isn't a parking ticket you can just pay off, Veronica. You were reckless. You almost hit someone. And you showed zero remorse in that courtroom. What did you think was going to happen? She threw her hands up. I thought I'd get a fine. Maybe some stupid driving course, not manual labor at some dirty shelter. Her lawyer shook his head, his tone exasperated but firm. You should consider yourself lucky. If that man had suffered a worse injury, or if someone else had been in his place, you'd be looking at criminal charges, not community service. Do you even realize how bad this could have been? Veronica folded her arms, looking out the window in frustration. Whatever. I'll do it. But I won't like it. Her lawyer chuckled bitterly. No one's asking you to like it, Veronica. They're asking you to learn from it. Monday morning, the shelter Veronica pulled up to the Westside Community Shelter in her luxury car, parking at the far end of the lot as if she didn't want her vehicle tainted by proximity. She sat there for a moment, staring at the rundown building with distaste. The building was nothing like the pristine restaurants and designer boutiques she was used to. The exterior paint was peeling, and people loitered outside, people who looked nothing like the crowd she associated with. Some sat on the steps, talking quietly. Others leaned against the walls, bundled up in oversized coats despite the warming sun. A man in tattered jeans gave her a curious glance before returning to his conversation. She wrinkled her nose. This was not her world. She checked her phone. 7:58 a.m. 2 minutes until she had to officially start this nightmare. Rolling her eyes, she grabbed her handbag, completely out of place here, but she refused to not look good, and stepped out of the car. The moment she entered, the smell hit her. Not unpleasant, but different. A mix of cleaning supplies, cheap coffee, and the faint scent of overused fabric. She barely had time to take it in before a voice called out to her. "You must be Veronica." She turned and found a woman staring at her. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, no-nonsense posture. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "I'm Linda Carter," the woman introduced herself, extending a hand. "I run things around here." Veronica looked at the offered hand as if it were covered in dirt. After an awkward pause, Linda lowered it with a smirk. "Right. Let's get started." She led Veronica into a back room, where other volunteers were gathered. They were dressed practically, comfortable sneakers, t-shirts, nothing flashy. They looked ready for the kind of work Veronica was dreading. Linda clapped her hands. "All right, everyone, we've got a busy morning. Breakfast rush is coming up, so we need volunteers on food prep, serving, and cleanup." Before Veronica could even think of objecting, Linda tossed her an apron. "You'll be on kitchen duty today." Veronica gawked. "Excuse me? I don't do kitchens." Linda arched an eyebrow. "You do now." The volunteers snickered, and Veronica felt a flicker of humiliation. "I don't even know how to cook," she said. "Perfect. You'll be on dishwashing," Linda replied without missing a beat. Veronica's jaw dropped. Dishwashing? Was this some kind of joke? Linda pointed to a doorway leading into a hot, humid kitchen where trays of food were being prepared. "Gloves are over there. Get started." Veronica stared at her, waiting for some indication that this was a test, a prank, something. But Linda just walked away. With a scowl, she grabbed a pair of gloves and stomped toward the sink. An hour later everything about this was awful. The rubber gloves were too tight, her sweater was too expensive to be around this much water, and worst of all, the dishes just kept coming. She scrubbed a tray furiously, muttering under her breath. "This is unbelievable." Behind her, an older woman chuckled. "First time." Veronica turned to find a woman, maybe in her 60s, stacking clean plates. Unlike Veronica, she looked at ease. "Yeah," Veronica muttered. The woman smiled knowingly. "I figured. You've been sighing loud enough to shake the walls." Veronica rolled her eyes. "Because this is ridiculous." The woman shrugged. "Could be worse." Veronica scoffed. "Really? How?" The woman stopped stacking plates and looked at her. "You could be on the other side of this counter." Veronica frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman gestured toward the dining area. From where they stood, they could see people lining up for food. Men, women, even a few kids. Some wore mismatched clothes, others looked like they hadn't had a warm bed in weeks. "That could be you," the woman said simply. Veronica felt an odd twist in her stomach. "I doubt it." The woman gave her a wry smile. That's what a lot of people here used to think too. Veronica didn't reply. The end of the day. By the time her shift ended, Veronica was exhausted. Her arms ached, her back was sore, and she smelled like dish soap. But something else was different. She had seen things today. She had seen a man break into tears just because someone gave him an extra portion of food. She had watched a mother and her 2 kids eat slowly, as if they wanted to make their meal last forever. She had met people who once had jobs, homes, lives that looked nothing like this, until life took a wrong turn. And she couldn't shake the woman's words. That could be you. She sat in her car for a long time before driving home, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, Veronica Sinclair had nothing to say. Veronica sat in her car for what felt like an eternity. The engine hummed softly beneath her, but she barely noticed. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically against the leather. She stared at her own reflection in the rearview mirror, but she barely recognized the woman looking back. Something had shifted. She had spent the day surrounded by people she would have never given a second thought to before. People she once viewed as beneath her. And yet, as she watched them, listened to their stories, saw their gratitude for things she had always taken for granted, she had begun to feel something she hadn't in a long time. A deep, gnawing discomfort. For years, Veronica had convinced herself that she was untouchable. That life would always cater to her whims, that she was immune to struggle. But as she wiped down tables, scrubbed dishes, and handed out trays of food, she had realized something terrifying. The only difference between her and them was circumstance. She thought of the elderly man who had eaten in silence, his hands trembling as he lifted his spoon. Linda had told her he used to be an accountant before medical bills drained his savings and forced him onto the streets. She thought of the young woman with the 2 children, their clothes clean but worn, their eyes cautious yet hopeful. She had once lived in a comfortable home before losing everything to an abusive partner. And she thought of the teenage boy who had reminded her of the kids she used to mock in school, the ones who weren't born into wealth, the ones she and her friends laughed at for wearing last season's fashion. He had been in foster care since he was 10. He aged out of the system with nowhere to go. Veronica clenched her jaw. These were people who had once lived normal lives. They weren't lazy, they weren't failures, they weren't nothing, they had simply fallen on hard times. And for the first time in her life, Veronica understood that privilege wasn't just about what you had, it was about what you never had to worry about losing. She leaned her head back against the seat, exhaling slowly. Her phone buzzed beside her. She glanced at the screen. Tasha Sinclair, her mother. With a sigh, she picked it up. "Hey, Mom." "Veronica, where are you?" Her mother's voice was sharp, impatient. "Your father and I have dinner reservations. You were supposed to be home an hour ago." Veronica hesitated, glancing at the shelter's entrance in the distance. A few volunteers were still inside, laughing and chatting as they finished up their work. She had been given the option to leave earlier, but she had stayed behind to help with cleanup. "I was busy," she said simply. "Busy?" Tasha scoffed. "Doing what?" Veronica hesitated. Then, for the first time, she answered honestly. "Community service." Silence. Then, a disbelieving laugh. "Oh, God. That ridiculous sentence. You're actually doing it?" Veronica clenched her fist. She could hear the condescension in her mother's voice. Could hear the same arrogance she had once carried herself. "I don't have a choice," she said, her tone clipped. "Of course you do," Tasha replied. Hire someone to sign off on your hours. You don't actually have to do the work, Veronica. Your father and I can call our lawyers. No, Veronica cut her off. Another pause. No. No, Veronica repeated, her voice firmer this time. I'm doing the hours. Tasha scoffed. Veronica, be serious. You have nothing in common with those people. This is a waste of your time. Something inside Veronica snapped. Those people. She had said it so easily, so dismissively, as if their struggles were nothing more than a stain on society, something to be ignored, to be swept under the rug, to be looked down upon from a pedestal of wealth and privilege. Those people had worked harder than she ever had in her entire life. Veronica gritted her teeth. Maybe that's the problem, Mom. Tasha sighed. Oh, for heaven's sake, don't tell me Judge Langston got to you with one of his moral lessons. I swear, that man thinks he's some kind of savior. Veronica glanced back at the shelter. Maybe he was. Listen, Tasha continued, oblivious to her daughter's thoughts. Just play along, do whatever nonsense they want you to do, and when this is all over, we'll pretend it never happened. You'll be back to normal. Back to normal. Veronica let out a humorless laugh. What was normal? Shopping sprees? Lavish vacations? Carefree parties where no one thought about what happened outside their bubble. For the first time, normal felt hollow. I don't think I want to go back to normal, she admitted softly. Tasha paused. Excuse me. Veronica swallowed hard. I have to go. Before her mother could argue, she ended the call. She sat in silence for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her phone back down. Then, with a deep breath, she started the car. But instead of heading home, she turned back toward the city. 2 weeks later something was different. Veronica no longer showed up to the shelter wearing designer clothes. She left her expensive jewelry at home. She didn't park her luxury car at the far end of the lot like she was ashamed to be seen there. She showed up on time, ready to work, without rolling her eyes or sighing dramatically. At first, the other volunteers had been skeptical. Linda especially had watched her closely, waiting for the moment she would complain or snap or throw a tantrum. But she didn't. She listened. She learned. She worked. She didn't just wash dishes anymore. She started serving meals, sitting with the guests, listening to their stories. She met a man who had been in real estate before the market crashed and wiped out everything he had. She met a woman who had lost her home after a medical emergency drained her finances. She met a teenage girl who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. And the more she listened, the more she realized just how thin the line was between her world and theirs. One wrong move. One stroke of bad luck. One moment of vulnerability. That's all it took. By the end of her sentence, Veronica wasn't counting the hours until it was over. She wasn't rolling her eyes when Linda assigned her tasks. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that courtroom, smirking at the judge as if nothing could touch her. And when she stood before Judge Langston again, she didn't argue, didn't scoff, didn't fight. She simply said, "Thank you." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. "What will you do now, Miss Sinclair?" She thought about it for a moment. Then, she smiled. "I think I'll be back at the shelter." Veronica Sinclair's story is not just about a privileged socialite learning the value of humility, it's a reflection of how easily we can become detached from the struggles of others when we live in comfort and security. While I may not have the same level of wealth or entitlement as Veronica, her journey reminds me of the importance of self-awareness and empathy. It's easy to go through life focused on our own problems, dismissing the hardships of others as distant realities that don't affect us. But the truth is, like Veronica, we all have moments where we fail to see beyond our own experiences. Her transformation from indifference to understanding teaches a powerful lesson. Privilege is not just about wealth, it's about recognizing the advantages we have and using them to contribute positively to the world. One of the biggest takeaways from Veronica's story is the realization that circumstances can change at any moment. Many of the people at the shelter weren't always struggling, they had jobs, homes, and stability before life took an unexpected turn. This is a humbling reminder that no one is truly immune to hardship. Whether it's financial instability, health issues, or personal loss, life has a way of testing everyone. This means that instead of judging or distancing ourselves from those who are struggling, we should focus on compassion and support. I find myself reflecting on this lesson in my own life. How often do I overlook the struggles of those around me simply because they don't directly affect me? How often do I assume that someone in a difficult situation is there because of their own choices rather than external circumstances beyond their control? Another lesson that stands out in Veronica's story is the importance of accountability. At the beginning, she refuses to acknowledge the consequences of her actions, dismissing the harm she caused as insignificant. This mirrors how, at times, we all try to justify our mistakes instead of owning up to them. Whether it's in personal relationships, work, or daily interactions, avoiding responsibility can only take us so far. Veronica's journey shows that true growth comes when we stop making excuses and start accepting the impact of our choices. In my own life, I can apply this by being more mindful of my words and actions, making sure that I am not disregarding the feelings or experiences of those around me. Veronica's time at the shelter also highlights the power of direct exposure to new experiences. Before working at the shelter, she had a narrow, privileged perspective on life. It was only when she immersed herself in a different environment that she truly began to change. This serves as a reminder that if I want to grow as a person, I need to step outside my comfort zone. Reading about the struggles of others is one thing, but actively engaging, volunteering, having conversations, and experiencing different realities, creates a much deeper understanding. This has inspired me to look for opportunities to connect with people outside of my usual circles, whether through community service, mentorship, or simply listening more intently to the experiences of others. Lastly, the biggest lesson from Veronica's transformation is that change is always possible. No matter how deeply ingrained our habits or beliefs may be, we always have the ability to evolve. At the start of her story, Veronica is self-absorbed and entitled, but by the end, she chooses to return to the shelter on her own, not because she has to, but because she has changed. This reinforces the idea that personal growth is a choice. We can choose to remain indifferent, or we can choose to open our hearts and minds. In my own life, I want to make that choice consciously, every day, to be more aware, compassionate, and accountable for my actions. So, if there is one piece of advice I can take from Veronica's story, it is this: never underestimate the power of a shift in perspective. The more you expose yourself to the realities of others, the more you will grow, not just in knowledge, but in empathy, humility, and purpose.